Yeah, okay.
Yes, you go ahead.
Right, okay. So, good evening, everyone. Very warm welcome to you all, and thank you for joining us this evening for this CME program organized by the CPD Committee of the College of General Practitioners of Sri Lanka. I'm Dr. Anojana Jayaseelan, and I'll be moderating today's session. And the topic for today is titled Curry, Carbs, and Chronic Disease: Practical Clinical Strategies for Managing Metabolic Risk in Sri Lankans, which I believe is a highly relevant and thought-provoking subject for all of us in clinical practice. And well, a few things for us to keep in mind before as we go along. May I kindly request everyone to please keep your microphones muted throughout the presentation to minimize background noise. And at the end of the session, we will have time to discuss some questions. So you're welcome to either unmute yourself then or share your questions in the chat box. And with that, I'm pleased to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Nelum Dharmapriya. Dr. Nelum Dharmapriya is a Sri Lankan born, Brisbane based specialist general practitioner with 25 years of experience, with a special interest in lifestyle and metabolic health in midlife women, including menopause care and insulin resistance. She is the founder of Whole Food Revolution, a health education platform built on three pillars: science, lifestyle, and mindset, recognizing that sustainable change requires all three. Dr. Nelum also has a strong clinical focus on cardiometabolic risk in South Asian populations, and her 2025 Low Carb Down Under presentation on South Asian dietary patterns reached over 78,000 views in just 2 weeks. And so it is my great pleasure to invite Dr. Nelum Dharmapriya to speak to us. And on behalf of the College of General Practitioners of Sri Lanka, a very warm welcome to you, and thank you so much for being here with us today. Over to you, Dr. Nelum.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Anojana, for that introduction. And hello to all of you. It's a real honor to be here talking to you, being, Sri Lankan GPs. I don't know how many of you actually listened to my talk, Curry Carbs, Chronic Disease, last year. Well, that came out this year, that it was done last year at the Low Carb Down Under conference. But this talk has a similar thread to it, but it is specifically for Sri Lankans. And I hope that really, my focus is really about practicality, about giving you something that actually that works and that you can actually put into practice. So I hope this not only helps your patients, but also helps you. So let's get started. So firstly, who am I? So I was born in Sri Lanka many, many moons ago. And I went to school at Visaka, and I actually entered the Colombo faculty in 1988. So that tells you my age. And then there were, problems in Sri Lanka, universities closed down. And so that meant that um, I went off to Scotland to do my degree, and that's where I did my medical degree, and I graduated in 1995. And then I've been a GP now for about 25 years, and I've been in Brisbane since 2009. So, as Anojana said, I am the founder of Whole Food Revolution, which is an online platform that supports mainly women, 40 plus. And I'm also a GP educator. I do a lot of educational kind of talks and workshops here in Brisbane. But really, what brought me here to this space was my own journey. And, a few years ago, so this image of me on the left here, this was in the early 2000s. I was overweight, belly fat, snoring, terrible sleep, brain fog, poor metabolic health, pre-diabetes. A lot of particularly women in their 50s will probably recognize this. This is very, very common. And And this was despite what I thought that I was doing everything right. I thought I was eating healthy. I was definitely eating low fat. Um, I was exercising, really, I was exercising practically every day. But despite that, this was where I was. And so it was quite a challenge because as doctors, this is what we're taught to, eat less and move more. And the fact that I felt I was doing it all, but I was not really, I wasn't healthy. And that was when, you know, I looked into, well, what else should I be doing? And that was quite an interesting question because I think as doctors, we're kind of brainwashed into thinking in a certain way. Um, so once I started to look into, well, what else could I be doing? And really found out about insulin resistance and what that meant for me. I think that is what changed everything for me. And really what I found was that it was really important to understand insulin and insulin resistance. And for that, that meant that I had to be low carb. I had to be eating low carb, and we'll talk about that as we go along. And for a Sri Lankan person, this is really hard. The thought of, what was I going to eat? If I wasn't eating carbs, what would I eat? And how would I socialize with my family and friends? So this was all a problem. But I realized that really nothing had worked so far. So, let's give it a go. So, I just started slowly, just started by maybe just increasing my protein intake and cutting down my carbs. And within about 3 to 4 months, I noticed massive changes. And really, you can see this image on the right there is me probably about 6 months later, and I had lost the fat, particularly around the belly. Um, I I did not snow, and I'd snowed for nearly 25 years, and now I don't snow. I'm sleeping better, mental clarity. I couldn't do what I do now as I was before because I was just so foggy in my brain. And I have reversed my pre-diabetes, and all my metabolic markers were, kind of improved and have stayed that way since. So then, that's fine. It was great for me. But I then looked around at my friends and family, my Sri Lankan friends and family, and realized that so many of my friends, family, patients, had the same problems and at very young ages. I was only 50 when all of this started. And that's quite a lot earlier than a lot of other ethnic groups. And looking around, and you probably know this yourselves, for yourselves and for your patients, your family, that disease for us South Asians and Sri Lankans start early. And so then that's when I started thinking, well, I really need to focus on how I can improve things for my Sri Lankan community. And so this talk is based on that. So let's carry on. So what this is more broad. This is for South Asians. So what this slide shows is the heavy burden of disease faced by South Asians, and obviously Sri Lanka is part of the South Asian uh, um, area. And you can see here almost 1 in 5 already have prediabetes, about 1 in 10 has diabetes, and often at much younger ages and lower body weight. And the risk of heart disease is nearly double compared to white Europeans. Fatty liver is common even in people who are not obese. And on top of that, high blood pressure and kidney disease are widespread, often showing up earlier and progressing faster. And on the left here, you can see that these are the big studies that have been done in India, Pakistan, and the UK, and showing exactly the same, all tell the same story. South Asians get diseases earlier and more severely and at lower risk threshold than other groups. The disease burden is very high, and we need tailored strategies to address this. So let's just very briefly touch on the health status in Sri Lanka. So this was as of 2023, 2024. So the population at the moment in 2024 was 22 million in Sri Lanka. Life expectancy in females 79 and males 74. And the major health challenge, this is not just in Sri Lanka, but all over the world, the shift from infectious to non-infectious communicable diseases, NCDs. And the main cause of death in Sri Lanka, cardiovascular disease, is 38%, cancer 10%, chronic respiratory disease 8%, and diabetes 6%. And then if we look at it in this graph, this is from the BMJ in 2023. It was national. This is from the national survey details. And this showed that there's quite a high prevalence of overweight and obesity, close to 40%. So this was 2023. And you can see that hypertension, prediabetes, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, all pretty high, and diabetes about 23%. So, and these NCDs occur often at much younger ages, about 10 years earlier, and at lower body weights than for white Europeans. And so, it's a huge problem, isn't it? And you are on the ground, you see these every single day. Um, and the issue is that things like prediabetes converts to type 2 diabetes within 3 to 5 years. That's 30% faster than the Europeans. And this was from a study done in the UK with 400,000 Indian and Pakistani people. So not quite Sri Lankan, but we're of the same ethnic group. When do diseases begin in Sri Lanka? So actually, early changes can be seen in our 20s, and then the risk factor accumulation happens between 30 to 40, and disease onset and detection happens at 40 plus. So I think we need to really be thinking about this, and particularly in our younger age groups, and thinking about our children. I mean, at my age, I'm sure most of you are a lot younger than me, but really thinking about our 20-year-olds and screening, and we will talk about screening, what screening we can use. And the reason why it's so important is there was one study done in India of Indian youths aged 16 to 25, which found that 30% of them had hyperinsulinemia. This was in 2023. So, I wouldn't be surprised if we found a reasonable number of metabolic disorders in our younger age group too. So the key here is don't wait for symptoms. By age 40, many have metabolic changes that are already in motion. Yeah, it's a serious problem. So now I really want to talk a little bit about what metabolic health is and insulin resistance, because as doctors, this is not how we're taught, and you'll see what I mean as I go along. We all know what insulin is and what insulin resistance is, but we know it really in relation to type 2 diabetes, but we don't know it generally, I don't think. And so I think it's just good to be able to go over that very briefly. So what is, sorry, I'm just going to move this. Go. What is metabolic? What is metabolic health? So metabolism refers to how the cells in the body converts the food that we eat into energy and building blocks that are essential for life, and how the cells eliminate any metabolic waste from the body. And metabolic health is an indicator of how well our metabolism is functioning, so how well our cells are doing. And why is this so important? Because now we know that most, if not all, non-infectious chronic disease, so the non-communicable diseases, has at its origin a metabolic dysfunction. So all of these conditions and more, so type 2 diabetes, heart disease, stroke, hypertension, Alzheimer's disease, do you know that Alzheimer's disease is now known as type 3 diabetes? Because it's the same mechanism, the same pathology that affects the brain, that affects the body. Cancers, PCOS, infertility, pain syndromes like migraine, erectile dysfunction, chronic inflammation, mental health. There's a whole new area of mental health that is now starting to gain popularity, called metabolic psychiatry, and then obviously weight gain and obesity. So the underlying metabolic dysfunction that is key to developing these chronic diseases is insulin resistance. And I will explain this in a little bit more detail. And if there is a metabolic origin to a problem, there is always a metabolic solution. And I think for me, this is so powerful and gives me so much hope and optimism. The thing about it is that the solution is foodable and not druggable, or not always druggable. And the reason for that is, how long have medications been available? Only for about 75 years. And despite billions of dollars being spent on medicines, a majority, only a few of those work at the level of the cell. A lot of the medicines that we use work downstream from the cell. So if it doesn't work at where the problem originates, that's the issue. All right. So if I was asked, and I'm sure that most of you, if you were asked, can type 2 diabetes be reversed? Can type 2 diabetes be reversed? 5 years ago, I would have said no, because we can't with medicine, because that's what happens, isn't it? That most of the medicines that we have, they help us to manage, control the disease. And the best I think we can hope for is that we can keep our patients stable with the medication that we use. But there's very few non-communicable diseases that we can actually reverse with medication. But with food and lifestyle, we can. So the metabolic solution to reversing insulin resistance is with a low-carb, healthy fat, whole food lifestyle, which prioritizes protein. So I will talk about this in a little bit. And just briefly, so this then we will talk very briefly about metabolic syndrome. We all know what this is. These are the measurements these measurements, the 5 measurements that tell us the state of somebody's metabolic health. So blood pressure, elevated waist circumference, elevated fasting glucose, triglyceride levels, and reduced HDL. So cutoffs, you can see that. Now it's interesting that in South Asians, our waist circumference, we have to, it's a lower waist circumference. So we need to, in men should have a waist circumference less than 90 centimeters, and in women less than 80 centimeters. Okay. And I just wanted to touch on this as well, even though it's not part of the metabolic syndrome, that in South Asians, a BMI of 23 is overweight and 27 is obese. I didn't realize that until I started looking into this. So why is this important? Metabolic syndrome is defined as having 3 out of the 5 markers, and it is estimated that 25% of Sri Lankans suffer from metabolic syndrome. And among older or higher risk groups, this figure may be much higher, closer to 50%. So I want to talk now about insulin because I think it's so incredibly important to understand insulin and why it is the key role that it plays in metabolism. So I call insulin the queen of metabolism, and insulin is the key player. So most of you know that insulin is secreted by the pancreas. And its main role is to keep glucose levels in the blood under control. Okay, so I have to say 2 things about this glucose. Firstly, um, anything more than 1 teaspoon of glucose in the blood at any one time is highly toxic in the body. 1 teaspoon, that's 4 grams of glucose, okay? And the other thing is, once we have glucose in the body, the human body doesn't have a safe mechanism to get it out. Okay. We can't safely wee it out or poo it out or sweat it out. The only thing that we can do once glucose is in the body is to put it somewhere safer than the blood. That's what we can do. So that's where insulin comes in. So as we know, when carbohydrates are broken down, it's broken down into glucose, and it's broken down into glucose in the gut, and then it's absorbed into the bloodstream. And so, as I said, anything more than 1 teaspoon of glucose is toxic in the blood. So, you can imagine for 1 teaspoon of glucose, that's not very much, particularly not for us Sri Lankans. We eat a lot of carbs and a lot of glucose on a regular basis. So, you can imagine if that's what's happening in the body, as soon as we've had this carbohydrate load, the pancreas is going to release large amounts of large amounts of insulin. And now, what does the insulin do? Now, if, let's say, last night for dinner, let's say we had some rice, okay? One of the most commonly eaten foods in Sri Lanka. So let's say we had rice and curry for dinner last night. Now, the rice is digested into glucose, it's in the blood. Now, if after eating we got up and walked around, we went for a little walk around the block, 10 minutes, then because we're using our muscles, because we're actually exerting ourselves, some of the glucose is utilized by the muscles as fuel. So the muscles can directly take this glucose from the blood to be utilized. If we did that, great. But 90% of us, that's not what we do, okay? We probably sit and we watch TV or we sit. That's what we do. So if we haven't utilized that glucose, what happens to this glucose? So insulin comes in, and this is what insulin does. So insulin looks to see where can we put this glucose. The majority of glucose tends to be put into muscle. So muscle is what we call our glucose sink. About 70% of the glucose that comes through food tends to be stored in muscle. Now, that's if we have a lot of muscle and that glucose store hasn't been already used by what we've eaten throughout the day. Because, we don't eat once or twice a day. Most of us will eat 5 or 6 times a day. We snack, we have our meals. So, and if we haven't moved our body, if we haven't actually exerted ourselves, then those glucose stores in the muscle are already full. So if they're full, there's nothing we can do about that. So then the insulin, and we can also put a little bit of glucose as glycogen. So all the glucose stores, as you know, are stored as glycogen. So in our muscle, we have the capacity of storing up to 400 grams of glycogen in our muscle. Now, this is in any human being, okay? What I mean by that is if you have a 25-year-old strong, hunky, young man, then he will probably be able to store that 400 grams. Um, a 60-year-old woman or most older Sri Lankan men do not have the capacity of storing that kind of glycogen, because we don't have as much muscle. And then we can also store some of this glucose as glycogen in the liver, a very small amount, 100 grams. So really, maximum of 500 grams of glucose is all we can store in the body. Everything else is taken to the liver and turned into fat. So that is, that's what happens. And that fat then gets distributed throughout the body, and a majority of it, particularly in us South Asians, gets deposited as visceral fat. So if you have a look at this diagram here, the subcutaneous fat is this light brown area, which is outside the abdominal cavity. And that is where fat should be stored. It is the most it is the safest place to be stored. Visceral fat is the fat that's red, and that's stored inside the body and also can be stored inside organs. And this visceral fat is highly toxic. It is very highly inflammatory, and it is associated with metabolic syndrome, cardiovascular disease, malignancy. It is very, very toxic. Um, so, so now if we carry on, eating in the way we have been eating. So if you think about, so what I talked about earlier with that rice meal was just one meal, right? But if you think about what we've been eating, what we eat in a day, in a week, in a month, in years, since the day we were born, what have we been eating? We've been eating carbs that gets converted into glucose. So when the diet is high in sugar, starches, or grains, the level of insulin remains elevated because the pancreas is constantly secreting insulin. So we are in a state of hyperinsulinemia. And so if you look at this little image here, if you're eating carbs, we need insulin. So we need, so before I get to that image, what happens here is this leads to when you have hyperinsulinemia, insulin is a storage hormone. We have different names for it. We call it a growth hormone. We can call it a storage hormone. So what insulin is programmed to do is to store. So it tells the cells to store the fat, to store the glucose. That's what the insulin does. So the more insulin you have, you are in storage mode. You cannot break down fat if your insulin levels are high. And I think it's really important to understand that. To be able to lose weight in the right way, we have to reduce insulin levels. And the other thing is then, let's say now we've eaten this way, and now we have this level, this high level of insulin. So now, after a while, the body's tissues become resistant to insulin's effect, because any hormone, hormones tend to go up and down. That's how they're supposed to function. That's the optimal functioning, to rise and to decline. But if we've got a hormone that is constantly elevated, the body becomes resistant to it. So now that is what we call insulin resistance. And so when we have insulin resistance, now imagine if somebody is insulin resistant and you've had a meal of rice, and the body, if you've had rice, it's digested, you've got glucose in your bloodstream, the pancreas releases insulin, but the cells are resistant to insulin's message, which is to bring to store. So that means to be able to store the glucose as glycogen, we have to be able to remove the glucose from the blood. So if we aren't able to do that, then what happens is the blood glucose remains elevated. Now, I forgot to mention one thing, that in the human body, the only way we have to manage glucose levels is through insulin. So then the pancreas releases more and more insulin in a desperate measure to try and get these glucose levels down. So now we not only do we have high glucose, we now have high insulin, and we have insulin resistance. So this is the triad of insulin resistance. So if you look at this image, we're eating carbs, we need insulin, the pancreas is releasing insulin, the cells and the body is less sensitive to insulin, the pancreas has to release more insulin, and we go round and round and round. And so this is the start of all these metabolic problems. So what does it mean to be insulin resistant? So we've talked about all of these conditions. So, when I discovered this, when I realized the extent of the importance of insulin resistance, it blew my mind, because this is not how I was taught. This is not how any one of us were taught. I thought, because I, graduated 30 years ago, that I had somehow missed a huge part of new learning. And I asked my younger colleagues, and none of them knew this either. Yes, we know about insulin resistance, but we don't realize the significance of this for health as a root cause of nearly all chronic disease. And now I very briefly want to touch on macronutrients and their effect on insulin. So macronutrients are what food is made out of. So food is made out of protein, fat, and carbohydrates. That's all. So if you look at this diagram, we've got blood insulin on one axis and time on the other. And what this is showing is the level of how quickly and how much insulin rises depending on the macronutrients, what we eat. So if you look at carbs, you can see that blood insulin levels rise very steeply, very quickly when we eat carbs. So if this is a typical, so I remember going and seeing my mom my mother who lives not too far from me. I went to see her at about 10 o'clock one morning, and she said to me, "Nelum, I'm starving," because she had had 2 slices of white bread with jam at 8 o'clock in the morning. So what's that? That's literally sugar. There's nothing good in that meal. So you can imagine she had this literally this refined sugar, and there was this huge increase in blood glucose, which prompted the pancreas to release large amounts of insulin very quickly. The insulin rose, that quickly brought the blood glucose down, and the blood glucose came crashing down. And at that point, when blood glucose crashes, that is when you're starving. And that's where my mum was. So she was starving. And at that point, me telling her, have a carrot stick or have something like that, have a lettuce or whatever, is not going to work for her, because she needs something sugary, or to bring up her blood sugar, blood glucose levels. So this is what we call a glucose roller coaster. When you have carbs and just these refined carbs, you tend to have the glucose spiking and crashing and spiking and crashing. It causes all kinds of things, we get angry and irritable. We want to eat just sweets, all of these mental health, anxiety, all of that, we're very unstable when we have just very high glucose or refined glucose carbohydrate meals. Now look at protein. Protein, like eggs or meat or fish. When you have a protein meal, you can see that, yes, the insulin levels do rise, but it's much more tempered, isn't it? It's a gradual rise and a gradual fall. So this is typical if you have, let's say, um, some eggs or some dal or something like that in the morning, or some atta or something, mung atta, let's say, you tend to be um, full for longer. So that's typical of what you see with protein. But look at fat. Look at fat. Fat really does not raise insulin. So that's interesting, isn't it? So the question that I'm going to ask is, can eating fat make you fat? Just think about that. Now, we know that it's insulin that tells the body what to do with the energy that we use, where to store it, what to do with it. So if fat doesn't raise your insulin, is it fat that makes us fat, or is it carbohydrate? So it's very interesting. Okay, so that we will talk about. I'm sure you have lots of questions at question time. So let's just talk about, how do you check for insulin resistance? How do you know? I mean, there are blood tests, but if you are obese, you have high blood pressure, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, you have insulin resistance. You are at risk if you have a waist size of more than, I think, 80 centimeters for women. I think that's a mistake, and 94 for men. This is a really easy one, the waist to height ratio. So your waist circumference should be less than half your height. That's a really easy way to know if you have insulin resistance, or how to tell your patients about it. Skin conditions, skin tags, particularly around the neck, and also the pigmentation, around the neck and the armpits, that as well. Blood tests. Now, fasting insulin. Now, I don't know if, you need to put in the chat whether you can actually check for fasting insulin in Sri Lanka. I'm not sure. So fasting insulin, fasting glucose, HOMA IR. HOMA IR is a calculation. It gives us, um, it it tells us, it gives us a much better overall picture about insulin resistance. HbA1c, which is the 3 monthly average blood glucose, blood glucose levels, raised triglyceride to HDL ratio. So the triglyceride, so this is a really important measurement, much more so than the LDL cholesterol. So triglycerides refer to the excess carbs, that are taken to the liver to be converted into fat. Okay, so the higher the triglycerides, the more, so that shows that there's too much carbohydrate in the diet. So ideally, we want a triglyceride to HDL. Oh, let me just go through this. So fasting insulin, ideally, insulin levels need to be low, and fasting insulin should be, so fasting 12 hours of fasting, fasting insulin less than 6 is what we want to aim for. Fasting glucose, so I know that we have HbA1c, which is the 3 monthly average blood sugars, is 6.5. Now you might be using a different measurement, but this is the percentage. But what I use now is a fasting glucose of less than 5.5 is what I'm wanting. HbA1c, 6.5 and above is type 2 diabetes, and anything more than 5.6 is prediabetes. Triglycerides ideally need to be less than 1. HDL levels in men should be higher than 1. So this is the high density lipoprotein, and in women it should be more than 1.3. So ideally, we want to have a triglyceride to HDL ratio of less than 1. That is what points towards good insulin sensitivity. Raised liver function test, particularly the ALT and gamma GT. ALT in particular tells us about fat in the liver, and ideally this needs to be less than 25. And then we can do an oral glucose tolerance test as well. This is the gold standard. So it's just a difficult test to do, having to fast and hang around for 2 hours. So you can ask me questions about that as we go along. So now let's unpack South Asian risk, okay? So what predisposes us to having, such increased risk at lower ages and lower body weights? So genetic predisposition, yes. South Asians do have a genetic predisposition. And I don't know if you've heard about the thrifty gene hypothesis. This is an evolutionary theory that suggests that humans carry genes that were once advantageous for survival during times when food was not very not easily available. And particularly in South Asia, there were times, there was many famines over the thousands of years. And so the idea is that particularly South Asians became very efficient at storing fat. But then that goes, that's the problem. We're wired to store fat, but we have a modern sedentary lifestyle and we have a high carb diet, which really pushes us towards increased visceral and ectopic fat. So even though genes explain part of the risk, it does not explain it all. So one of the, I think it's really important, this point is very important, and this is beta cell dysfunction. So beta cells are found in the pancreas, and beta cells are what make insulin. And in South Asians, there's a reduced insulin secretion from the pancreas because these beta cells are less efficient in South Asians. So there is a lower insulin secretion capacity seen even before diabetes. So this is a genetic predisposition. So this leads to visceral fat and inflammation. Sorry, visceral, then the fact that we South Asians are more prone to storing fat in the visceral area, and that visceral fat increasing inflammation worsen beta cell dysfunction, and these overworked cells burn out. And so because there's an insulin shortfall, which causes metabolic dysfunction. So this is really important because the other issue that we have is that we South Asians have low muscle mass and increased ectopic fat. So, many Sri Lankans and other South Asians develop diabetes and heart disease even when we're not overweight. So this is, I'm sorry, there's a lot of words on this slide, but so let's just go through this. So we have low muscle. So generally, South Asians tend to have less muscle than other ethnic groups. So therefore, because we have less muscle, we have less capacity to store glucose. So we have less capacity to use that glucose. And many Sri Lankans have smaller muscles, so the body cannot clear sugar well, so higher diabetes risk. Um, and so yeah, so that's one. And then we also have what's called a lower personal fat threshold. So just that's another that's just that's our phenotype. That's just how we are made. We don't have the capacity to store as much fat in the subcutaneous areas as other ethnic groups do. And that's because, Sri Lanka, we are a tropical country, and if we had a lot of capacity to store fat on the outside, we won't be able to keep ourselves cool, right? So we don't have a lot of capacity to store fat on the outside, and subcutaneous fat is the safest way to store fat. It's kept outside of the important organs inside the body. So because we don't have that capacity, we tend to store fat on the inside. So even at normal weight, Sri Lankans hit harmful fat levels earlier. And then that's what we have. We tend to have this belly fat, okay? And that visceral fat increases risk of diabetes, heart attacks, and strokes. And then, there's only a limited space in the abdominal cavity to store this visceral fat. So then what happens is there's fat also being stored in the organs. So this is now fat within the organs. So fat can collect in liver, pancreas, in heart, in muscle, and this causes inflammation and insulin resistance. And so, fatty liver we know is very common, and the non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, greatly increases risk of diabetes and heart disease. And the thin, fat Sri Lankan body. So this is a picture of my father, and he's holding his prized patola. But you can see that he's got a little bit of a tummy, and he's got kind of skinny arms and legs. That's what Sri Lankans look like, right? So this is also called the tofi, thin on the outside, fat on the inside. So many people look slim, but have a high body fat ratio and a low muscle. And this is a real problem. So same BMI and more fat. So this was demonstrated by the Yudkin-Yajnik paradox. And that was, so Yudkin was a European, and he had a BMI of 22.3, and that was the same BMI as his South Asian friend, Dr. Yajnik. But Yudkin only had a body fat percentage of 9%, while as Yajnik had a body fat percentage of 21%. So, same body mass, but completely different body fat percentages. So this is another reason why, Sri Lankans and South Asians are prone to these problems. And then think about our lifestyle, what we eat. We eat a lot of high carb foods, rice, roti, upper, in the upper, the whole, sweets. So most of these are refined grains and refined flours. So it causes a rapid blood sugar spike. And then, the introduction or the introduction of westernized diets into Sri Lanka. When I was growing up, um, in the 1970s, 80s, there was none of this, these all these fast food outlets and things like that. So, yes, we ate rice, but it was mostly cooked at home, cooked by somebody at home. It was all whole food, and even if we went out, we generally went out to other people's houses, didn't we? And if we had and generally the sweet that we would have had mostly was fruit. Yes, you might have some ice cream every so often, but it's not like it is now. I think there's a lot more availability, easy access, it's cheap. So this is the other issue, that on top of our high carb diets, we've got the introduction of these westernized foods that are highly processed, and contain trans fats and sugary drinks in particular, really very, very toxic, contributing to obesity and insulin resistance. And then, unfortunately, the other problem is South Asians. We are apparently the laziest ethnic group in the world. According to a WHO study, or according to the 2025 WHO physical activity profile, this is Sri Lankans, nearly 40% of adults are physically inactive. Women are worse, nearly 50%. And this is, I think, the younger generation might be better, but I think, 40 and above, so if we're not physically active, we gain weight, we have low muscle or muscle mass, and that contributes to all the other metabolic conditions that I referred to. And then I think something that we really don't talk enough about, stress and mental health. And this is the work pressure, in particular financial issues, ill health, family expectations, all of these things. You work in Sri Lanka. I know that you know what I'm talking about. So this causes increased cortisol, which is our stress hormone, and that also drives insulin resistance and increases visceral fat, and triggers unhealthy eating patterns. So when you put all of this together, the high carb diet, processed food, low activity, chronic stress, add that to the genetic predisposition, evolutionary traits, the body composition that's typical of South Asians. And it's clear why metabolic disease is so common in South Asians, and why it's so important to have strategies to address it. So let's now talk about the lifestyle prescription for South Asians, or Sri Lankans in this case. And it's all about balance. So just, you can put it in the chat. What is the first thing? Some of you may have heard this already, but what is the most important thing I'm going to talk about next? What do you think it is? Is it food? Is it exercise? Is it, what is it? What is the most important lifestyle change that we need to be making? Or let's have a
Mind?
look. Mind, yeah, mind is very important. You are absolutely right, but there's something even more important than that. No, well, let me show
Sedentary
you.
lifestyle?
Here we go. Let's see. You kind of know, not quite, but let's see. So the most important lifestyle measure to improve metabolic health is sleep. Because without the right quantity and quality of sleep, nothing that I talk about is going to be possible. So it is incredibly important to prioritize sleep. 7 to 9 hours of quality sleep. And, this is really difficult for Sri Lankans because, we eat late, we sleep late. So it is really important that we prioritize this and that we actually get to sleep before 10 p.m. And the reason is it's all to do with hormones in the body, with melatonin, that is our sleep hormone, that increases gradually from about 6 p.m. and kind of peaks around that 10 to 11. And so if we go to sleep at midnight, we've lost that peak of melatonin, and that's when we struggle. And because we eat late, we have, it's very, very, it's all to do with hormones. Our bodies are controlled and managed by hormones. So really important to prioritize sleep and to avoid late night caffeine and alcohol. So I know that this is not going to be popular, but alcohol unfortunately disrupts sleep significantly. Stress reduction. um and then talking about stress reduction, so important. So you were right. I think one of you mentioned stress. It is so important. I feel that we simply don't talk about stress enough, and we don't realize the importance of how much stress has an effect on our metabolic health. That's a huge another topic, but it is so important. And we are so fortunate in Sri Lanka. We have so many ways. Firstly, there's all our cultural and religions that we have in Sri Lanka have so many techniques that promote stress reduction, mindfulness, meditation, yoga, breath work, community connection, whatever it is, you must. It is so important that you for yourselves prioritize this, and that you encourage your patients to do something as well. Really important. Okay, but I know that most of you want to talk about food and everything else, so let's talk about that. So that was sleep and stress, and now how do we fuel our bodies? Okay, so most important thing, prioritize protein with every meal. This is, if you're struggling to know where to start, this is where you start. Because if you prioritize protein, everything else falls into place. So, proteins, I'm not going to go into a big lecture on proteins because I can talk for another hour on protein, but we have limited time. But the proteins are our building blocks, okay? Um, we don't use protein as fuel. The only time we use protein as fuel is when we are starving, if we are in starvation. So it's not a good idea to use protein as fuel. We use it for muscle, tendon, every single thing that we build, we need protein. Bone, how many of us actually think of protein for bone? We talk about calcium, vitamin D, all of that, but we don't talk about protein. So important. It keeps us full. So for this lifestyle, this is really important. That if you have more protein, you are full. If you're full, you're not constantly thinking of food, you're not craving sugar, So it improves body composition, it protects skeletal muscle, and it increases metabolic rate. So protein is very, very important. And how much protein should we have? So this is where the problem is. So we need to be having 1.2 to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram ideal body weight. So ideal body weight is not your current body weight, but ideally, so this is really, it's what we call the lean mass, okay? Lean body mass. So if we take away all the fat, then, what are we left with? So for most women, I would say women need about 70 to 80 grams of protein per day, and men need about 80 to 100 grams of protein per day. Now, it's really important to just clarify what I'm talking about. So, protein food and protein are not the same thing. If we're talking about animal protein, um, 100 grams of animal protein. Let's talk about chicken, right? Just now, in this way of eating, we're not going to be weighing and measuring and counting and doing that. But we all need to have an idea. When I'm talking about 100 grams of chicken, you need to know what I'm talking about. And we're going to use our palm size. And it's an approximate. My palm is different from your palm size, but it's just to give you an approximate. So 100 grams of cooked chicken, chicken curry, roast chicken, whatever, it doesn't matter, about a palm size, gives you about 25% protein. So animal fat, animal foods, cooked palm size portion will give you about 25 grams of protein. Plant proteins, yes, there's a lot of plant proteins. They give you much less. So if you want to know a little bit more about that, I have you can take actually I have this article that I have written because I know that a lot of Sri Lankans love their copy. Just I'll put this in the chat. So this is here we go. Um, a, 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 an article that I've written on plant versus animal protein to give you an idea. There's because there's a lot that you can say about it. So it's really important to prioritize protein and a minimum of 30 grams of protein with your first and last meal. And this is to kickstart muscle protein synthesis because without having that 30 grams, that science says that you need to have a certain amount of protein called leucine to kickstart muscle building. And that leucine is available in the 30 grams of protein. Okay, so you can ask me questions about that as we go on at the end. If you prioritize protein, then it is much easier to cut down on the starches and sugars. And it's really important. Then that means that you can easily reduce your portions of rice, roti, bread, and sweets. It's not about stopping. It's not about not having any of these. It is impossible, I think, for a Sri Lankan person to be no carb. And it's hard to be low carb. But it can be done, and unfortunately, it's the science. The science says that this is the way we need to be eating. So it's really important. So save desserts for special occasions. Now, there was a study done it was reported in Diabetes Care in 2020, and in South Asians, each extra serving of white rice increased risk of diabetes by 11%. So even the smallest reduction will make a huge difference. So just reducing, you don't need to cut it out, reduce it. And make smart swaps. Use low GI rice, the nadu rice, the low GI flours, things like korakkan. In Australia, I use a lot of cauliflower rice and nut flours, things like almond and coconut flour. I think you can get these things in the cities, maybe in Sri Lanka, instead of the refined white carbs, the white rice and the polished white rice and the white flours. These are really, they have such a high GI index. And increase non-starchy vegetables. We are so incredibly lucky in Sri Lanka. We have so many beautiful vegetables that we can eat. And we do, can't we? We can curry anything. So any of those, all these non-starchy vegetables, really good. And you can cook them in traditional spices, perfectly fine. And this is what I want to show you because this came as a huge shock to me. what does 150 milligrams of white rice look like? Right? So I actually measured it, and it's that amount. It's that this 150 milligrams of white rice has 10 teaspoons of sugar. And what did I say at the very beginning? Anything more than 1 teaspoon of glucose in the blood at any one point is highly toxic. And well, who in Sri Lanka eats just this amount? Well, I certainly didn't. I used to eat 3 or 4 of this. I used to have a plate full of rice. And it's shocking, isn't it, that this so you can see where the problem is. Not only are we eating too much of the carbs, then adding all those other things in that I described earlier as well. So that study from 2020 that said even reducing this amount, so this amount of this portion per meal of white rice will reduce your risk of diabetes type 2 by 11%. That's huge. And there are many, many simple ways to improve insulin resistance. And in Sri Lanka, we are so blessed. We have so many incredible spices and herbs that help with insulin resistance. Cinnamon, turmeric, pepper, fenugreek, curry leaves, ginger, garlic, cloves, cumin. We use these in all our cooking. It's amazing. Choose healthy fats. And when I talk about healthy fats, that's not vegetable oils. In Sri Lanka, Sri Lanka is very fortunate that you don't have as many of the industrial seed oils, things like the sunflower. I mean, I know that you have it, but most people don't use it. What is available as vegetable oils in Sri Lanka is called the RBD, refined, bleached, and deodorized palm oil. So even though it's not as bad as the industrial seed oils, these are very, very highly processed, and they're very toxic. So ideally use, if you can, the cold pressed coconut oil, ghee, butter, olive oil. These are much, much better than and less toxic, less inflammatory than these vegetable oils. And that might be a little bit controversial. We've been taught something completely different, but these are whole foods. These come from natural foods. They're not processed, and they're not highly processed. Avoid processed and deep fried foods, because a lot of these are, well, firstly, they're fried in vegetable oils, and a lot of these are processed. So, things like biscuits, buns, shorties, fried snacks, these are all made with the refined vegetable oils. Now, this is interesting. Cool and reheating rice or potatoes. So what happens, we all love to have the hot rice, right? But the problem is that if that rice has a high amount of that, when we eat it, it will increase our blood glucose levels very quickly and increase our insulin. But if we cool the rice, and then reheat it. So cooling the rice changes the starch into what's called a resistant starch. And it causes a much smaller glucose spike. And then if you reheat it, it doesn't change back. So if you cook your rice, cool it, and then reheat it, much, much better for you. So that's a simple thing you can do. Use vinegar with starchy meals. So the Japanese do this all the time, and it's not a particular vinegar, but if you have 1 tablespoon of vinegar, even the white vinegar that we have in Sri Lanka, mixed in water before eating, that also, particularly before eating a high carb meal, that reduces the post-meal sugar and glucose rise. And cook more at home. This is so important. I was in Sri Lanka over last Christmas, and people spend so many of their meals are eaten outside, aren't they? So if you're eating out, there's no way they're going to use all these techniques. So if you eat at home, you have a much better chance of having controlling some of this and making better choices. So this is, I want to just say that I don't know whether some of you have kept up, but very recently in January, the USA announced that their food pyramid had completely been changed upside down. And this is massive for global health because everybody follows the US in terms of their dietary guidelines. And so the US now says, so this is for people with metabolic disease, which is a majority of the Western world, but significant proportion of Sri Lankans and South Asians too, is that at the bottom of the pyramid, which is eat most, is protein, um, dairy, eat quite good carbs, that is low starch vegetables, and yeah, low carb fruit and vegetables, uh, and then some starchy vegetables at the bottom. Sorry, down here they even mention butter. So it's so this is the so I mean things will gradually change and come through. So this has just been implemented in the US, and we will watch this space. So that's the food. Okay, so we talked about sleep, stress, food. Then mind your timing. So this is very important. And I think, having talked to a lot of people in Sri Lanka when I was there, I think a reasonable number of you are doing this a little bit of a time restricted eating. But first, before we come to time restricted eating, ideally we need to be eating dinner at least 3 hours before bedtime. Because if we eat too late, we have, our body spends a lot of time into the night digesting food when the gut should be resting. And if you have high insulin, the body doesn't produce melatonin in the same way. So it compromises sleep as well. And then rest the pancreas, time restricted eating. So eat within an 8-hour window. So if you can delay breakfast to brunch, uh, have a maximum of 3 meals a day. So if you have 2 meals, that's great. Avoid snacking. Snacking increases those insulin spikes. And this really improves insulin sensitivity and weight management. So I think, if this is something that I think most people can incorporate into their lifestyle, eating. So if you finish dinner a little bit early and have your breakfast if you can at about 10 o'clock. It depends, if you're busy and if you don't have facilities at work to have something to, microwave or warm up or something like that. It's difficult, I understand, but it is really important to try and rest that pancreas, because remember, South Asians have a smaller capacity to secrete insulin. So we need to preserve that as much as we can. And time restricted eating really preserves that. Build muscle. This is the most important thing. Okay, so by 80, we would have lost 50 to 60% of our muscle mass. And we talked about it, South Asians, we start off with low muscle. And so we need muscle for maintaining strength, structure, and function. Muscle is also our organ of longevity. It's our glucose sink. It improves metabolic health, and it gives us higher survivability with age. So this is a study of the Thai population. Because unfortunately, there are no studies in Sri Lanka that I could find. And there was a study or a consensus paper from India which kind of said the same thing. So basically, what this shows is mortality rate according to BMI and possible sarcopenia. So sarcopenia is age-related muscle loss. Okay, so in the blue is possible sarcopenia, and then the clear is no possible sarcopenia. And this is the BMI category here. So underweight, normal weight, overweight, obesity. And this is mortality rate on the y-axis here. So the higher you go, the higher the mortality, the higher the death rate. Okay. So what this shows is for every single weight range, if you have less muscle, if you have sarcopenia, your possible sarcopenia is the blue, you have a higher mortality rate. Okay, so it's really important that we think about this. And so movement, what do we have to do? What kind of movement are we talking about? Build muscle. So firstly, we talked about it before, South Asians have less muscle. So it is really important to build muscle. So strength training. Now, when I was in Sri Lanka talking to friends, family, what I noticed was that a lot of people walk, that's their exercise, but particularly people 40 and over, they don't lift. They don't actually strength train. So I think this is something that I highly recommend. So strength training and eating more protein to build muscles and improve metabolic resistance. And that could be just 15 minutes twice a week. You don't have to go for hours to the gym. There are so many online. If you go online and just say home-based strengthening program, you can start off. And simple examples like squats and lunges, wall sits, push-ups, planks. There's so many things that you can do. You can use those bands. So very, very important. And then, high intensity training. This is very important. So the build muscle is basically to build muscle. I don't have to explain that. High intensity training, what we're doing here is these short bursts of effort. They help empty the glycogen stores in the muscle, and that boosts insulin sensitivity and protects the pancreas. So examples like hill sprints, skipping, fast cycling, burpees, we're not talking long, we're talking 30 seconds. 30 seconds at the highest intensity. So if you're walking, if you're somebody who walks, then just do 30 seconds. So if you're walking along and you do an interval of running or walking really fast for 30 seconds, and then you so you slow down your pace and walk for 2 minutes, 2 or 3 minutes to get your heart rate down, and then go again for 30 seconds, and you repeat that 4 times. If you take the time, that's 10 minutes, 10 to 12 minutes. So it's very, very feasible. And then move. Every bit of movement counts. All of us now in the world, wherever we are, we just sit. That's what we do. Just moving, walking, gardening, cycling, cleaning, climbing stairs. Get sunlight for vitamin D. I know that Sri Lankans, particularly as women, we are not happy to be out in the sunlight. But sunlight is not just for vitamin D. It is so incredibly important. We are human beings. We evolved to be in the sun. I'm not talking midday sun, but I think getting out into the sunlight is so important. And make it fun and cultural. Cricket for the men and women, dance, yoga, martial arts, drumming, whatever it is so important. So I just want to show you, this is a campaign that I ran in 2024 when I was on holiday, and this campaign was called 10 Squats Anywhere, Anytime. And wherever I went, whoever I was with had to do these 10 squats with me. So I thought I'll just add it in for a bit of fun. Oops, sorry. So basically, for South Asians, it's all about balance. Okay, it's not about saying, no, you can't do this. No, it's combining. So it's impossible to expect South Asians, Sri Lankans, to cut out the carbs or to eat as little carbs as the Westerners can. Because, food is so central to us, and this is the food that we eat. So instead of asking people to give up their traditional foods, it's about balance, okay? And by adding in some fasting and some strength training, it creates space to be able to eat those meals with our family and friends. So I think that's really important. So that's what it's about. And that's what I've realized. For me, what I do, it's called an 80-20 rule. 80% of the time when I'm at home during the week, I eat well, I eat lower carbs and I eat well. And at the weekend, or if I'm out with my family and friends, I eat whatever I want. Well, I eat my Sri Lankan food and I don't regret it. I savor it. I think that's really important. And I just want to very briefly, how am I doing for time? Research gaps in South Asian health. I just want to just say that, um, that particularly women are undercounted, overlooked, and at risk. So there's very few studies on South Asian women. A lot of the studies are based on men and particularly white men. So I think it's really important that, as a South Asian country, that this is something that Sri Lanka takes on and does some research on. So finally, I want to say to my fellow Sri Lankans, you don't have to give up everything you love to be healthy. Lasting wellness is about priorities, balance, and compromise, not sacrifice. And with the right choices, you can honor your culture and protect your health. And this is, if you want to take a picture, these are my contact details. You can contact me through there. And so that's it. How am I doing for time? Oh, I'm quite late, so sorry about
That's
that.
okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Nelum. We can all agree that this has been a very productive and very informative as well as an interesting session for all of us. So thank you for highlighting some very important aspects that we don't always get the opportunity to explore in day-to-day practice or even our lives. So, and one phrase I will remember is it is foodable, not druggable. That's
Yeah,
that. Yeah. So, okay, so we'll open the forum now for questions. We have a
stop
few
share. Wait a minute, let
on
me
the
stop the
chat
share.
box as well. Yeah, so to your question on the fasting insulin test, there is a comment that it is available in the private sector. There is a first question from Dr. Eranti Walkampaya, how to tackle the metabolic issues in hypothyroid Sri Lankans.
Hyperthyroid.
Hypo.
Hypo. Okay, so basically, a hypothyroid is, so first we have to, hypothyroidism in most cases is easy to manage. We replace the thyroxine, and I think it's really important. That's another, generally I don't know about you, but we are encouraged just to check the thyroid stimulating hormone and to see how the levels are. But I think it is really important to check the breakdown of T3 and T4 as well. But once you've got the hypothyroidism under control, then I think there isn't anything else that you just do whatever you're doing otherwise, because it is once you've got the levels to where they need to be, I don't think there is an issue.
Okay. Thank you for that. And Dr. Sendil Kumar asks, is fatty liver a pre-diabetic condition? But I think fasting blood sugar and PPBS is normal.
So is it a case? So fatty liver is a pre-diabetic condition, yes. And so it tells you that, and that's the thing. So The problem with fasting glucose, and that's what we all check, isn't it? So now you probably do understand that the glucose levels are maintained at the expense of insulin. So insulin rises over time to keep blood glucose levels under control. So if we are only checking blood glucose, which is what all of us usually do, then we miss it. We miss that rise in insulin that tells us that there is a problem. So if we can, if it's not easy, but maybe you can check the triglyceride to LDH, HDL ratio, or looking at, or even the LFTs, to look for pointers that suggest that even though the blood sugar levels are normal, that this person has a metabolic dysfunction brewing. Because really things like if we can check for fasting insulin, we can detect things like type 2 diabetes about 10 to 15 years prior to the actual diagnosis, which is massive.
Right. Okay. Thank you for that. And I think Dr. Sabit has a question. Yeah. You can unmute yourself, Dr. Sabit.
Hey, hi, Dr. Deshapriya. Thank you very much for that informative session. I've just got a couple of questions. The first
Yes.
is when we talk about the ketogenic diet. Now, this is something I think a lot of people do talk about. But what are your thoughts on the ketogenic diet? Because we do know that this was something that was it was found out by accident in those children who were having intractable
Epilepsy.
epilepsy, and then they found
Yes.
out that weight loss it was an effect, right? So
Yes.
when we talk about being on a ketogenic diet, I think whether there would be any long-term issues with vitamins and minerals in terms of deficiencies, right? The other question is in terms of when we talk about, you mentioned about high-intensity interval training. I'm just
Yes.
wondering between when you compare high intensity interval training and moderate intensity interval training, by engaging in high intensity interval training, whether there are any long term effects in terms of your wear and tear. Because we know if you're already an athlete or if you're very fit, then engaging in high intensity interval training may improve your VO2 max and improve your performance. But for the average Joe, getting in, say, if they're a bit on the overweight side, by going straight into high intensity interval training, they may have a lot of wear and tear, which may impede their exercise in the future.
Yes. All right. So let's talk about the keto diet first. Yes. So ketogenic diet fits into. So I talk about low carb. When I could talk about low carb. The keto diet fits into that. But the ketogenic diet is less than 50 grams of carbs per day. So it's very low. And I think incredibly difficult for South Asian Sri Lankans to manage this. But I don't know if you've been following the literature. There is so much benefit with the ketogenic diet. There is no issue. So it's not that you can't, you're not, the only thing there that you're limiting is the carbohydrates. So you still, the starchy carbohydrates. You can still get carbohydrates through the non-starchy vegetables. So there's nothing that you're missing. The proportions are different, and there's no vitamins that you lose out on. And for certain conditions, particularly psychiatry, for certain chronic diseases, you actually you need to actually maintain ketosis to be able to manage those conditions long term. So have a look at what's going around the world. There is so much happening, particularly metabolic psychiatry. It's all about a ketogenic diet, and they're doing that with no medication. Even taking people who have schizophrenia, bipolar disorders, they're managing just on a ketogenic diet. So it's incredible, the information that's out there. To your point, the next point, which is the high intensity. So it's not the same. We're not talking high intensity like a 45-minute what are those classes, those 45-minute high intensity classes? No, we're talking short bursts. So very short bursts, particularly for the over 40s. So we're not talking long bursts. We're not talking, 40 minutes of going crazy. No, it's just within what you're doing, you put so it's an interval training. So if you're going for a walk, and so what I usually say is if you're going for a walk and you've got, you're walking outside and you've got street lamps, then between, say, two street lamps, you walk as fast as you possibly can, and then you bring it down and you have to rest. You not rest, as in you have to let your heart rate come down for about, say, 3 or 4 lampposts, and then you go again. So that is really important. It is very important in terms of metabolic function.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We have a few more questions on the chat box. There's someone who asked, Dr. Kodituako asked, is it okay to eat more than 1 egg per day? Is there a safe amount?
Right, so now this is going to be quite controversial. Right, so at the low carb conference that I spoke at last year in Brisbane, the consensus was, as long as you're eating less than 2 dozen eggs a day, you are fine. That's 24 eggs, okay? So what I say is, if an egg has 6 grams of protein, so 1 egg from a protein point of view is neither here nor there. I encourage my patients, if you're having eggs, to have at least 3 eggs at a time. And I say you can have eggs for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It is a superfood, okay? It is nature's superfood. So it's a bit controversial, but anyway, so there is no issue with eggs.
Okay, thank you. And Dr. Hettiarachchi asks, do you recommend DASH diet pattern to Sri Lankans?
Now, just remind me about the DASH diet, Dr. Hettiarachchi.
Dr. Hettiarachchi, you can unmute yourself and you can ask us.
I can quickly check it out.
Madam, I have read in the food-based dietary guidelines of the Sri Lanka Health Ministry website that
Yes.
there is this specific diet called dietary approach to stop hypertension, which is mainly a type of a Mediterranean food pattern. So I haven't gone into extensive details inside this, but is it kind of recommended? I mean, not exactly the exact same diet pattern, but say something like a modified DASH approach to Sri Lankans, considering the fact that our BMI and our body build is different to Mediterranean people, although more than, kind of Westerners, we represent kind of Mediterranean people. What is your take on that?
Yeah, you are so right, Dr. Hettiarachchi, because to question that, because that's the thing. So a lot of the studies that are out there and that we take advice and information from are not based on South Asians. Okay, so this is an issue. And yes, the Mediterranean diet is the one that's quoted, or in every study, it is supposed to be the best. But there are so many different versions of a Mediterranean diet. So I think the key thing is to look at the science. What does the science say in terms of how does the body work? So if you're eating a Mediterranean diet that's full of good fats and fish and nuts and things like that, perfect. But if it's full of pasta and Mediterraneans also eat rice as well, that's not so good. So I think you've got to really look at that. And I think for so long we have been just fed diets, but I think we need to look at the science. How does it work in the body? What does it do? What happens to the insulin? You've just got to ask that question.
Thank you very much, madam.
Thank you. And Dr. Natasha asks, what is your opinion on fasting? That is any kind of fasting.
All right. I do recommend fasting, but I think you've got to ask so individuals have to ask why they are fasting. What is their purpose? And I think it is really, so fasting has to be balanced with having enough meals to get the nutrients that you need. So for instance, I don't know what it's like in Sri Lanka, but in Australia, there was a big move to once a day. So OMAD, one meal a day. And see, one meal a day, you can't possibly get the nutrients that you need if that's the way you're eating for months on end. If you have a system where you're eating one meal a day twice a week, and then the rest of the time you are eating your maximum of 3 meals a day, fine. So I think really it's about that balance between fasting and getting enough nutrients, because the other issue with prolonged fasting is if we don't fuel ourselves adequately, our muscle, we will break down muscle. And particularly as we age, we cannot afford to lose muscle. So fasting, I think, is very useful, but it needs to be, you really need to think about what your goal is and think about whether you're able to get the nutrients that you need into your week. It might not be in the day, because if you're only eating once a day, you're not going to be able to get it. But in that week, are you getting what you need?
Okay. And I think you answered this, but if you would like to add anything more, there's a question from Dr. Caldera. What do you recommend for vegetarians? How much eggs can an individual consume per day?
For vegetarians, eggs are a really good source of protein, and I highly recommend that you don't worry about it. And if you want to eat eggs, you eat it. And in terms of vegetarians, well, you can have, so the best source of vegetarian protein is soy. Unfortunately, I don't think soy, Sri Lankans, we don't eat as much soy, but it's a really good source. So the different atta, they are fine. And, if mung atta and kadala and things like that. But the problem with plant protein is that they always come with carbs. So if you're a vegetarian, vegan, or vegan, it's really difficult to be low carb. Because the protein always comes with carbs, so it's fine. You've just got to kind of make sure that you are getting the right amount of protein and think about the carbs. So soy is the best option if you are eating it. Quinoa, I don't know, can you get quinoa in Sri Lanka? That's a complete protein. That's a really good, that's another source. But otherwise, all the atta is fine.
Okay. And Dr. Sanduni Di Pinto wants to know what practical advice can be given to patients in Sri Lanka to increase protein intake when many protein-rich foods are expensive and affordability is a major barrier. Since even eggs, the commonly recommended low-cost protein source, can become costly when trying to meet daily protein needs. What are the most realistic, culturally appropriate, and budget-friendly strategies to implement a higher protein diet for low and middle income households? 3 eggs for 3 meals means 9 eggs per person.
No, I mean,
family of 4 can do it in a long-term situation.
Right. I do understand. I mean, it is highly unlikely that somebody's going to be eating 3 eggs 3 times a day. However, I think this is a question that's not only relevant to Sri Lanka. People ask this everywhere. In Australia, they ask, oh my gosh, this is so expensive. But is it? What you've got to ask is, if you prioritize this way of eating, then you are going to eat less of certain other foods, particularly the sweets, the excessive carbs, all of that, the soft drinks, the eating out at McDonald's and all of that. So I think that it's a compromise. So you balance it by putting most of your food budget into the good stuff, then you can balance it out. So it's not about, oh, I have to have more protein, but by eating that protein, what else can you get rid of? It's the junk. The junk has to go. And a family, if they're serious, they have to sit down and think about what is it that they're spending their money on. And surely it's about, so this is the thing. I think we all spend so much money on the outside, right? We get our hair done, we put our makeup on, we have these beautiful clothes. But when it comes to what goes into our bodies, they're like, oh, the cheapest will do. No, I mean, we've got to, this was me as well. And I think we've got to start thinking differently. We've got to prioritize good food.
That's true. So again, another question from Dr. Natasha. What is the role of eggs in dyslipidemia?
Okay, so now so this is a huge topic, okay, with dyslipidemia. And what I will say is that there's no proof that eggs cause dyslipidemia, and maybe that's something that we can touch on at a different talk, because that is another one of my pet interests. So if you are interested, I can send you some information on that. But yeah, eggs are not, this is a complete myth about eggs and fats and cholesterol.
Yes, so definitely maybe you can send us the links. We can share it with the participants. And
Yes.
I think we need to have another session on that topic as well. So moving on, another question from Dr. DiPinto. Is it appropriate to recommend protein powder as a practical source of protein for patients who struggle to meet their daily protein requirements through food alone, especially in Sri Lanka, where many natural protein sources can be expensive? What are the benefits, risks, and cost-effective ways to use protein supplements compared with whole food protein sources?
So when I was in Sri Lanka in December, I was kind of looking to see how expensive these protein powders are. They are expensive. So I feel that if money is an issue, I would rather go down the whole food. Okay. But if not, if it's somebody, that it's not because they can't afford whole food, yes, it's reasonable to think of a good quality protein powder. You've got to check the label, make sure there's, that it's not high in sugar, and particularly industrial seed oils as well. And really and just to use it as a supplement, not as that is the way the people are going to get their protein. But if it's money, I don't think it's the protein powder is the way to go. I'd rather put the money into the whole food.
Okay. So Dr. Sendil Kumar asks, banana and pepper are the fruits consumed daily by most Sri Lankans daily. How safe is it for diabetes?
So a banana, now I don't have the numbers for the pepper, but a banana, in Australia we have the long. What's the long banana in Sri Lanka? What's it called?
Anamalu or dole.
Anamalu, yes, has 6 teaspoons of sugar per banana. Okay, so it's not that we can't have bananas, but we cannot have bananas every day. And most people, even the small, the small, is it Sini? There's a small one, isn't there? They are very sweet. They're lovely, aren't they? But nobody ends up just having one. You have multiple. They're very high in sugar. So mango, banana, pepper, pineapple, dates, these are the high sugar fruits. They are whole foods. So if you are not having any other source of sugar, great. But otherwise, these need to be limited. So the low carb fruits are the berries, in Sri Lanka, avocado, guava. Passion fruit is a low-carb fruit, watermelon, star fruit, those ones. That is the low-carb fruits. But yes, that's a good question. Bananas are, I think we overlook bananas because they're fruits. They're good for you, right? And if you are having fruit, eat your fruit, don't drink them, because one of the benefits of fruit is the fiber. If you are putting it into like a smoothie or something, you're pulverizing the fiber, and you've lost that controlled glucose absorption.
Okay. And Dr. Natasha asks, what type or what color of rice is recommended for patients with diabetes?
Well, actually, okay, rice is not recommended for patients with diabetes. However, in Sri Lanka, it is it's the parboil. Is it the nadu rice? The nadu rice, the raw red rice, those are better. So you've just got to keep away from the polished white rice.
How about basmati?
Basmati that's polished white rice, right? I think. It's not the best. So it's fine if you have that small quantity so that, but remember, even that amount is 10 teaspoons of sugar. But if you have it, so now I'm going to say something. So if you made fried rice and cooked it in butter, and have a lot of vegetables, vegetable fried rice, if you're not vegetarian, you put some eggs in and made a fried rice like that with a small amount of rice. That's great, because you've got your vegetables and your protein and your fat to fill you up. So therefore you can make do with less rice. You can't do that and have the same amount of rice, then that defeats the purpose. But if you have a small amount of rice and make a fried rice with butter or coconut oil, perfect.
Okay. And so another one is coconut milk used in most Sri Lankan curries. What is the best method when cooking to use or not to use?
I know. So there's been, coconut flour, coconut milk, coconut oil. It's come into fashion, gone out of fashion, come into fashion, but it's a whole food. It's what I mean by that is if you get the cold pressed coconut oil and the coconut milk, it is one of the best sources of good fats. It's really a good source of good fat. So if you can get a good quality coconut oil or coconut milk, perfect.
Good quality as in what we generally use?
What I mean is, it depends on how refined the oil is. So typically in Sri Lanka, what is sold in the common supermarkets and markets is the processed coconut oil. So if you can get the cold pressed coconut oil, which is not refined in the same way, it is much more stable and not as inflammatory. It is more expensive, and I don't think it is available in rural areas. This is probably be in cities and in supermarkets.
Okay. Dr. Lianage wants to know dietary recommendations for a vegetarian with iron deficiency anemia.
It's really hard, isn't it? It is very hard, because this myth about spinach is that you have to have tons of spinach to be able to get iron through there. So for a vegetarian, firstly, not a vegan, a vegetarian. So, okay. So eggs, even though it's not the best source, but any animal protein if you are having dairy or eggs, will give you something, but it'll have to then come from your pulses, Yes, and of course you will add in the spinach and things like that. And you might have to take an iron supplement because so many even non-vegetarians have iron deficiency anemia, even our young children. So it's a real problem, and I think it's very important that you monitor that.
Okay. And Dr. Mendis wants to know, Madam, tell us importance of drinking water related to meals and how much water to drink and the timing of water that should be drunk before the meal, during the meal, or after the meal. I think he wants to know about the intake of water, the importance of drinking water related to the meal.
Okay, so I think water is important. I don't know that there is whether there's any science around whether it should be before, after, during, or after. I know that there sometimes people say if you have water before the meal it fills you up, but it's not an actual lasting fullness. So I would just make sure that you are drinking adequate water, particularly after your meal. And the recommendation, and again, I don't know if this is science or whether this is just a saying, but we generally need to have 2 to 3 liters of water per day, particularly in countries like Sri Lanka where it's hot and humid, and just making sure that it's drink to thirst. I think that's the key. And I'm not sure that there are studies to say exactly how much water we need to be having.
Okay. Dr. Faziha wants to know, what's the place of olive oil in our food?
Yeah, olive oil is an excellent oil. It's mainly it's the mono unsaturated oil, which is very, very good. The only thing with olive oil is that you shouldn't cook on high heat with olive oil because it's a mono unsaturated. It still means that it's got one double bond that can break, which then makes it more inflammatory. So you just you can use it on salads and things like that, or cooking on low heat. But coconut oil, that's why it's so good, because it's a saturated fat. It has no double bonds that can break. It can't be easily damaged. So that's why coconut oil and ghee and things like that are very, very good and safe.
Okay, thank you. I just have something to ask. You told about after a meal, if we go for a small walk, the food is used up. You just mentioned about that. Just to elaborate on that, after a meal, is it okay to exercise? If so, how long after a meal? Like we'll say dinner. After dinner, after how
10
long?
minutes, 10 minutes, Anujana. 10 minutes of walking is all you need to really help to stabilize those blood sugars. And that makes a difference.
How long
How
after?
long after? Oh, I mean, we're not talking, heavy. You're just going for a little stroll around the block. So it can be immediately after a meal. It can be 10 minutes after. It doesn't matter, but I think after a meal, that is a really good habit to get used to, particularly after dinner.
Right. We have a few more questions coming up. Dr. Mendis asks, even if you take carbs, mainly still, if you keep the calorie deficit, you are supposed to lose weight and get rid of metabolic syndrome, isn't it?
Well, that's how what we've been taught, isn't it? Eat less, move more, we have a calorie deficit. But has it worked? That's 50 years we've had the eat less, move more. It doesn't work. It doesn't work because it's not calories that run the show. It's the hormones. It's insulin, it's cortisol, it's thyroid, it's all melatonin, it's all the hormones. So it's not about calories. It is that we have to get, that's what we've been taught for such a long time, and we're conditioned with it. But that's why we're in this mess. It's not the calories. So it's about what you're eating and how it impacts insulin, particularly.
And Dr. Jeevadasan wants to know, is gingerly, that is sesame oil, equivalent to olive oil?
Sesame oil.
Yes, gingerly oil or sesame oil.
What's gingerly? I
Equivalent
don't know what gingerly oil is.
sesame oil.
Sesame oil. Sesame oil, so it's a seed oil, isn't it? Sesame oil is a seed oil. So you have to ask yourself, how do you get oil from a sesame seed? What actually needs to be done to that sesame seed to get an oil, to get oil? That is where the problem is. That's the processing. So if that process, if it needs a factory to process this sesame seed into an oil, that's bad.
Okay, I think, do we have any more questions on the chat box? I wonder if I have missed any. Or would anyone like to unmute and ask? If I were to ask a general question that I received before the lecture,
Yes.
how can we bring about this health behavior change? Is there any particular model that we can use? And what is the expected timeline to see a positive health behavior change?
Right. Yes. So listen, it is, I think the key thing is to keep it simple. So this is why I always start with food, because even though sleep and stress are right at the top of the hierarchy, I think it's very hard to start there. I think you start with food because it's much more manageable. And I think the first thing for me, what I did was prioritize my protein. By increasing my protein, everything else fell into place. I could then reduce the carbs. I could eat less. I was full for longer. I wasn't thinking about food all the time. So I think that's where you start. But it's not easy. And when I talk to my Sri Lankan colleagues and friends and patients, it's not easy to get people to change. So it's about, I think it's constant positive feedback and guidance and support. I have many patients who've reversed their type 2 diabetes, and then 6 months later they're back again. And then we do, so it's lifestyle is never, it's not something that's finished and done with. It's about constant support and guidance. So I would say start with protein because that's the easiest way. I think if you're full and you notice that you're full and that you can go longer, it gives you confidence, and then you can start to reduce the things that, the carbs. And also to say it's not about not having the things you love. It's not that. I think it's about reducing and balancing. I think that's the key. And time frame, if you take this on board and somebody does like this, really takes this on board, 3 months, you'll see a massive difference. But you have to commit to that.
Okay. We have a few more questions that have come up. Are you okay with the time?
Yeah, that's fine. No, I'm happy to go.
Late there. Okay. So Dr. Delini would like to know, how about post-menopausal weight gain?
Oh, that's another one of my wonderful, I love the whole menopause side of things. So, Dr. Devini, this for a postmenopausal woman, it is incredibly important to cut down the carbs. But more than that, it is managing stress and sleep, because that is where, so insulin, we talked about that carbs, but there's the other thing that increases insulin is cortisol. High cortisol levels increase insulin. So as long as you have high cortisol, you cannot bring that insulin down. So if you have high cortisol and your insulin is up, you cannot lose body weight. So it is, it's postmenopausal weight gain is a very complex subject and needs a multi pronged approach. And I mean, it's worth starting with food, just talking about it. But for a lot of women, it is the lack of sleep. It is the stresses in their life with so many, at that age, there's so many things going on. And, then it is so incredibly important for this age group to add in exercise, particularly some strength training to preserve muscle, to preserve bone mass. So, all of these things, really important. It's a massive subject. And, I do love talking about it, but I don't think we have time now.
Yeah. So she also has another question with if you want to add anything else, what are the differences in the weight losing strategies between, probably she means postmenopausal and young age weight gain? Is there anything?
So, yeah, young age, in young people, and we will say, let's say under the age of 30 and even under the age of 40, and in men, you could probably go a little bit more. They can do the eat less, move more, and it'll work. It worked for us, didn't it, when we were younger? But as we get older and as that insulin resistance starts to increase, because remember, this starts around the age of 20 and then gradually increases, then that is so then the usual methods that work for us don't work. And also in menopausal women, what happens is with the decline and loss of estrogen, we become more our insulin levels start to increase and we become more metabolically dysfunctional. So that's why it is important to really target metabolic health at that point and really work on, the cortisol, the insulin, all of that.
Okay. And Dr. Sarojini wants to know, what is the place of swimming? Yes,
swimming, right. So it all depends on time. Swimming is an excellent overall, well, it's more for your heart, isn't it? It's a cardiovascular, it gives you cardiovascular benefit, but it doesn't help with bone mass. Because it's not a weight bearing. So I think that, so if you have time to do swimming as well as, because you can also do the high intensity in the swimming as well. So that's great. So you've got your general movement and you've got your, the high intensity training that you can put in there. But what you don't have is your strength and particularly your bone mass. So I think if you have then time to add a little bit more, so some jump training and some muscle building, I think that's great. And it's great for your mental health as well.
And one last question that I got was multigrain versus whole grains. What is the preferred carb?
Oh, whole grain is what right. Okay. So bread, really, I would say if you have the option of rice and bread, rice every time, at least it is a version of whole food. Bread in Sri Lanka is not a whole food. It's a processed food. So if you do have proper whole meal bread, then that's fine. Multigrain is basically white bread with some grains in. So multigrain. And if you have the option of sourdough, then that is even better. The sourdough whole grain.
Okay. Do we have any more questions? We've had a very good discussion for almost 2 hours now. Okay. If there is nothing else, yeah, okay. I think Dr. Sendil Kumar says a very practical lecture and discussion, and would like a lecture on management of dyslipidemia on non-pharmacological measures, diet and nutrition. So yes, we will look into that. And There was someone else who had asked if the recording would be available. Yes, it would be available. It would be shared on our college WhatsApp group. If you're not on it, kindly contact the college office and you can get it across. Your certificates also will be sent across to you because your email addresses have been given. So as we come to this end, I'm sure we all can agree that it has been very insightful, very enriching, and not only for us as general practitioners, but personally also for us. So thank you, Dr. Nelum, for so thoughtfully highlighting some very, very important aspects. And I would like to thank you once again on behalf of the college for taking your time to share your expertise with us today. And thank you also to all the participants. We had about 90 participants today.
Wow.
Yes,
Great.
for a very, very, interactive discussion for all the questions. So thank you so much for that. And we really hope that we can see you once again with another lecture for us, discussion for us.
Thank you. And thank you so much. And I really hope that you got something out of it, because I think there is so much with little simple things that we can do to improve our lives and the lives of our patients as well.
Okay. Right. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank
See
you.
and good
Bye.
night. Bye. Good night.